Yeah. Okay, but well, in general, I think, yeah, I will just, even though many people still don't have their camera switched on, I think we should be getting started now. And yeah, sorry. So chat's still popping up. Amanda Crabtree. When I met you first, I was like, I didn't even know who I was talking to. I was just like talking to Amanda, who I find a highly interesting and challenging partner to do projects with, and it was an honor from the beginning, and then I slowly started to understand Amanda is one of the mediators of the New Patrons program, who has like a lot of experience. Probably one of the most experienced mediators that we have at the moment, working with the protocol. She is, I don't know, are you the president director of the French New Patrons program, the Nouveau Commanditaire.eu, the association that you have founded, and she is heading an education program at the University of Lille, which is called Faire œuvre comme on fait société. So make art as you do society, a bit like freely translated, but Amanda, well, you know it best because you're like the most bilingual person I know. So I'm so glad that I'm not the one who has to, like zoom into one of your fields of expertise at the moment and one of your in-depth knowledge fields, but that it is Alexander, who everybody here has met this morning already, and whom I'm not going to introduce now, who has to pick one and who has to decide on, like, do we want to delve into the past or into the future, or into more specific problems. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mel, for the introduction. Amanda, thank you so much you're with us, because indeed you have a lot of experience. To start with, it's maybe interesting for everybody here to understand that the network of New Patrons mediators is not one organization. Yeah, it's not one national or international structure. The mediators are independent actors. Many of them in France, or I think all of them, are connected to their more or less own cultural organization, right, Amanda? So you kind of self-organized your practice over the years. Yeah, it was not that someone hired you as a mediator and say, here you have a job, do it. You basically had to build up everything, I guess, by your own. So my first question would be, how, like, what actually qualified you as a mediator when you first started? Why did you consider that you might be qualified to actually do that? And then how did you get it started structurally? Let's not maybe talk too much about money from Fondation de France. There was foundation that supported, but that's not the most interesting part of actually developing your practice. That is not only in France, but we will come back to that also in other countries in Europe.
Okay, well, thank you. Anyway, thank you for your invitation. Thank you for your introduction, Mel. We will discuss about how I challenge you. We've had some challenging discussions. We can take that up. So I'm part of the French network, and the French network is based on kind of I would say two groups of mediators. We have the historical mediators. We call them this because we've been doing these projects for over 20 years. So there's about 6 or 8. And indeed, as Alexander said, most of the historical mediators are attached to their own arts organization. And most of them are these independent structures. I, for example, with Bruno, who's my acolyte, my other half, we set up our own organization, and we are still working within this organization. What is specific in France, which maybe is also something that is more linked to what has been happening in Germany, is that more recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, some major arts institutions were invited to join the family. So we have now a couple of art centers that are recognized art centers. It means that they are sponsored, they are financed by the Ministry of Culture. There is a museum also, and a FRAC, a regional art collection, that now also does new patrons projects. But that's a fairly recent development. And it means in this instance that somebody within the existing staff has a new job to do. And of course, that poses also other questions and other problems. But that's another issue we can come back to. So in terms of legitimacy, we created Art Connection in 1994, and we were approached in 2000 to do new patrons projects, because we had already been doing projects in the public space that caught a few people's attention. And so I would guess our legitimacy came from experience that we already had, and art in public space, art in the public realm is also my research subject. That's what I do when I have time. And so we come from that background. Okay, so we had that legitimacy, but we had no experience specifically of the new patrons method. That we had to learn on the job by trial and error. And I think it's okay to say that. Mm. Yeah, trial and error, experimentation.
Share some insight, Amanda. I'm curious. I guess all the mediators in Germany, including myself, would say trial and error. We had to learn it by practicing. What were your strongest learning effects when you started first projects? Like, what were your discoveries?
I think, as you've gathered, I think from probably your discussion this morning, is that new patrons is actually a complex ecosystem. We talk now about biodiversity and ecosystems, and I guess new patrons is also an ecosystem, and you kind of got to get the balance. And when things go wrong, it's because one element goes wrong, and that can also have a knock-on effect, obviously. So I would say, if we look at the central issues, the commissioning group, for example, the commissioning group, the first job is to get that commissioning group as a cohesive entity, and that can be very difficult. That depends how that group came together, whether they are a group, whether they are an artificially organized group. You know, somebody decided that they should become a group, and so your first job is to organize the coherence within the group. Then you will have maybe somebody in the group who isn't totally aligned. So I guess in the beginning, we hadn't anticipated the potential difficulties of the commissioning group. We learned by experience that I find it difficult to deal with more than, say, 8 people. I would guess an ideal group is maybe 6 people. We try to avoid big groups. That is something that we learned from experience. We also learned from experience that if you have, for example, what we call a relay, somebody who's come to you and says there's this great potential for a project on this issue, and we say, who are the commissioners? And they say, well, we don't have them yet, but we have a good idea who they might be. If you have an artificially arranged group, that sometimes is complicated because they in themselves have been invited to take on this responsibility, and they might not be actually totally happy with the responsibility that they're being given to speak in the name of. So we're very cautious about that because we've had a few, I would say the main problems we've had with groups is because the people in the group do not feel that they are legitimate to take on that responsibility, or they don't want to. Yeah, the best groups.
We sometimes, you and I, we sometimes talk that due to certain circumstances, a project may come into being not exactly according to the protocol, as you just described. Like there's an opportunity maybe to get funding, or there's someone who says a project should be done, and then citizens are invited, which is not exactly what the protocol suggests. So I think what you're pointing is something very crucial, that the projects really work if the people have their own motivation, their own agenda, their own desire in it. And what Amanda and I often shared is that it's fascinating that at any moment, when you go back to read the protocol, everything is in there. No, Amanda, do you still feel the same after?
Oh, I do. Yes, I do. But then it's a protocol that then you can pull in different directions, but it has to kind of come back. You know, you can pull, but it has to at some stage get back, and the shape can be a different shape, but it has to be a shape. That's important.
How many projects have you done until now?
We've done 40 projects. 40. We have a new website from next week, so so don't look this week, look next week. We have done a lot of projects, and we have projects ongoing. Some of the projects we are more proud of, some of them were more challenging, some of them with time. Now, I think we are more adventurous. I think as you get more experience, then you take more risks. And I think this notion of risk is very important. In the beginning, it was probably easier because there was a little bit more money around, and we took less risks. We also were encouraged at the time to work with experienced, well-known artists. And so in effect, you are reassured by the fact that your artist has a lot of experience. Even if you're encouraging the artist to go where they have never been before, you are having a discussion with an artist who basically does have a good grasp of the issue. Whereas now, I think we take more risks, and we are more adventurous, and we want to innovate more. There's more.
What does that mean? What is risky?
What is risky? Well, once, I mean, just to come back to the first question, once you've got your cohesion with your group, which means spending time with them and making sure that the group get on and doing all that kind of convivial stuff to have a group that has confidence in you. When the group has confidence and you have a good relationship, then you can start taking risks in that you can then interpret what they are asking for in a slightly different way. So I say that when you have written the brief, when the group has put on paper what they think the issues are and what they think they want, then that's where you can read. It's like a piece of music. You can read that piece of music and you interpret it in a possibly different way. And I think we do that much more than we did in the beginning. And that's where you can take risks, in that you can actually perhaps interpret their commission differently, which will mean that you will ask, I mean, this is instead of actually saying, okay, you think you need a sculpture in that public space because that will resolve this, this, and this, we would probably no longer want to do that. And we would say, okay, the actual issue is this, so why don't we use that space as a performance space and create a new ritual, for example? And so we're actually at the moment trying to challenge ourselves so that we are also taking risks. And I think the types of artwork that we're producing is different to the work that we were producing 20 years ago.
And when you said experienced artists, the question was in the chat, and it's asked almost every time. Do the artists need to be famous? Or sometimes the question is, why do the artists need to be famous? Because there are quite some famous artists in the past of the new patrons. What is your typical answer to that? And what type of artist do you suggest to the citizens? How do you make choices?
Well, initially, as I said, I think this comes from our relationship with the foundation in France, in that we were encouraged to work with famous artists because they had the finances to enable us to do that. And they also needed, I would say, we were still in the beginning in a process of making this new patrons method legitimate. So they felt that was necessary. We needed those names. They needed a list of famous artists. We are no longer in that process. The method is legitimate. We don't have to prove it anymore. I would say I have worked with some very well-known artists, but I wouldn't say that those projects are necessarily the best. I think we're clear on that. I think what is important is the best artist for the project. Now, sometimes there is a reason to work with a famous artist or a well-known artist, and that might be politics, or it might be because of the finance. So, for example, we did a project with Erwin Würm, the Austrian sculptor. That was because the commissioning group and the commissioning group's finance organization wanted a well-known artist. So it was actually stipulated that we needed, and it was in a very public space in Lille. We had another, then to take it the opposite, do you work with very young, inexperienced artists? I would say that's probably more problematic. Young artists, I think it's a very, we will maybe come to that later, to do with the training and the teaching, but I think young artists who have very little experience of life per se will find it difficult to be in the middle of this negotiation, permanent negotiation with the politics, with the commissioning group. They might find it more difficult, and they probably have less experience, obviously, in their art. They're not confident enough to come up with a good solution. But they need more accompanying. But to give an example, we have a very nice commission. We had a very nice commission from a school, a secondary school, and the group of students we were working with wanted to change the school bell. They didn't want the bell. They wanted something else. And so basically they were commissioning a sound piece that would function every hour within the school community. This is a high school of about 1,300 students. And so initially, our instinct is to think, okay, sound artist. And we thought of famous sound artists, Christian Marclay, you know, have fun, invite the best. But that we thought was probably in the end not the right way to go, because when you work with a school, you need the artist to be present. You need the artist to be available, to be physically not too far. I mean, this whole thing about distance. I mean, apart from the COVID business, sometimes you do need projects where the artist is available. And so we invited an artist who was local, fairly young, but with some experience, with whom we had worked with, and we had a good relationship with that artist. And so we decided to give him this very ambitious project, and he did a fantastic job. You know, so that's where your experience with a specific artist enables you to make that decision.
Yeah, it's a very nice piece. I think Monday morning, the first bell starts like with laziness and
I have it here. I can play you a bit if you like.
Yeah.
Would you like a bit?
Yeah, and then Paul will bring up an interesting question afterwards, but let us hear some sound.
So I went to the high school last week, and it's been functioning for 7 years. Okay, mm-hmm. This piece is, I mean, it doesn't sound like a big thing, but it's actually quite a big thing in a high school to kind of completely completely make the bell disappear. So this is a piece that functions all over the school, and it affects the everyday experience of every person in that high school. Now, that does not mean that everybody likes it. That's another discussion. I would say some people, and notably the teachers, are not necessarily 100% fan of this piece, but the piece functions, and it's still there. And I think that's already in itself. And of course, the kids love it because it's the only school in the region that has a sound piece for their bell. Do you want to hear a bit, or I can give you the link if you like?
Yeah, just play a bit.
Play a bit. I made you host, so you should be able to just play it.
Okay.
And if it doesn't work, you send us the link. But if it works, I think it's a nice.
I had it. Hang on a minute. I just have to put up my. Usually I can do this. Here we go. Sharawagi. I got it ready earlier just in case. All right. Here we go. It's on SoundCloud anyway. You can. But this is Monday morning. Oh, that one. I'll put it back to the beginning.
Bonjour.
Very nice.
There we go.
Super.
There's lots. You can have a look on SoundCloud because there are 23 speakers. The sound is strange. I mean, it's very tinny, but that's because of the quality of the speakers. But it's a real soundscape. And we were very pleased in the end that we didn't go down the famous artist route. And we had a very long-term relationship between the artists, the school community, and they are now coming back to us for a new project. They want another artist in residence. So it means that you can also negotiate these long-term relationships with institutions like that.
Paul, do you want to bring in your question?
Yeah, it's something I would have liked to have asked Frances Hers, but was probably too nervous at the time. But it was back at our meeting in November 2019 in Paris. And Amanda, I'm just wondering at the foundation, what is the process of deciding which project will or will not receive funding?
Alors, we're talking about a different era now. So if we go back, this is Back to the Future, back to the foundation. The system with the foundation was that the mediators, basically, they are free to decide how they develop a project, which way they take it, and the artistic direction. We are given that that capacity. When we presented the projects to the cultural committee, the object of that meeting was for the cultural committee to be obviously au fait with the projects that were going on and the artists that we were thinking of working with, but their job was not to give us the okay. What they were specifically asked to do was to take in account the subjects, the issues that we were dealing with, so that they could then step back and say, well, how come the hospitals are suddenly waking up to new patrons, or how come schools are suddenly asking all the mediators to do projects, and then so that was the idea. They were not actually ever. They very rarely rejected a project. And it would not have been for the choice of the artist if they did reject a project, which was actually unusual, because a project wasn't presented unless it was basically okay. It was the issue that they felt wasn't being dealt with correctly. Mm-hmm. Now we're actually creating a new organization. We're creating how this new organization is going to function. And so this is an issue that we've got to deal with now, is how do we manage, there are about 25 mediators in France, how do we manage these issues? And another issue will be, how do we decide whether somebody can become a mediator or not? I don't know if that answers your question.
So the board is actually invested in notions of progress rather than a sort of top-down, I guess, power agenda. To put it bluntly.
Yeah, that's interesting. But at the same time, we are never evaluated. We don't get a mark out of 10 each year for our projects. I think the foundation puts its money on people in the first years, and basically if they didn't come up with the goods, if the projects were not good, then they weren't they were kind of naturally eliminated, as it were. I mean, there's been a lot of fallout. The people who are still here it's because we've wanted to keep in there, but also because presumably the projects that we've been doing have been deemed okay. And there have been a lot of people, a lot of curators who have done maybe one project and it hasn't worked out, or they haven't themselves found any enrichment in working like that.
I would say for 30 years, there was a unique historical situation that you will hardly find anywhere, because the Fondation de France made money available to enable mediators and citizens and artists to do whatever they would decide. And that has some technical aspects that maybe the public here will also be interested in. We in Germany got regular funding from France, not so much, but a little bit. And once money is given to a project, it sits on a bank account until it's needed. You very rarely have that structure. I myself had projects where the money was waiting for 4 or 5 years until the project was ready, to spend the money. And this is completely unique. And that really shows how funding politics can make things possible as an open civil society process if you just don't play by the typical rules that December 31st, everything has to be spent. And indeed, I confirm we were never evaluated. We actually never had to show proof of the money that we spent, which means there was a lot of trust. And the new patrons historically were really a family of people who tried to trust each other as much as they can and support them to make things possible. It's really a beautiful story, but the Fondation de France has changed politics. So this historical era comes to an end. And now, Amanda, you in France are struggling like we in Germany, the colleagues in Italy, in Belgium, in Spain, in Switzerland, in Cameroon, and others, how to actually get that practice on the street, without having a big body behind you, that pre-finances your practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are in the same position as you now. We are negotiating with the foundation. They are providing a consultant that we chose with them, and they will accompany this transfer. So we're in transfer mode. We have 2 or 3 years where they will accompany us, but they will not put money on the table for new projects. And so we are confronted. Yeah, we are confronted with that right now. I was invited this week. We had a big meeting in Dunkirk. The city of Dunkirk invited us on the idea that we would come with new patrons and we would work in a big part of the city. They specifically wanted the new patrons method. And we said, fine, no problem, but we are not coming with a check. And there was a kind of a silence, you know, And then, but we came anyway, and we're going to implement new patrons, and we will find the money, hopefully, because they want that method. But they will have to put money on the table to begin with. Mm-hmm. And that's, you know, that's life. That's how it, you know, that's how it is.
And tell us something about your projects that you do outside of France, because that's quite unique. Maybe you can quickly give us a picture on how broad your practice is geographically and how you come to these projects. Because typically when I'm asked where mediators work, I would usually say they work within their very region. It's difficult to imagine a mediator working in a culture that he or she doesn't understand, for instance, where you don't understand the mentality, the local histories, the struggles, etc. So how does that work for you?
So we are based in the north of France. So we can go as far as Normandy, up to Belgium, and we do have projects all over the north of France. We did experiment a project in Poland, and in Poland, we were confronted with, I would say, to be very, and I think you will understand this also, is that we were confronted with the occupation of public space and who is allowed to decide what goes on in public space. In Poland, obviously, it's very different, and we had underestimated that difficulty. We were invited to work with some commissioners in a neighborhood, but it didn't work out. And I think that the question is, who initiates projects in public space? This is like 10 years ago. It was too soon. I think now it'd probably be easier, because obviously, you know, time means that the society is changing, obviously, in all those countries. We work in England. In England, we have several projects. What I find in England is this confusion about participatory art. You know, in the Anglo-Saxon art world, the notion of participatory art is something that has been going on for years. But to say it in a very shortcut manner, there is a long history of artists, well-known artists doing amazing projects where they invite the public to participate, but the public, the audience, the people are not initiating the project, they're participating. So it's very difficult to get British people to understand that actually the project can start with the commissioners. And we're up against that quite a lot. There's a bit of a confusion. We're doing a project as part of a triennale. We've been invited by a curator, well-known curator in England called Lewis Biggs, who has had a lot of experience doing big projects in public space. He was very interested in new patrons, and he invited us to do a project. But again, it was a project that was called a semi-new patrons project, in that we had to work within a framework that was something that we had not identified ourselves. But what was very disconcerting is having Lewis Biggs, who's a very experienced curator, sitting in our meetings and observing the way we deal with the group. How do we elicit discussion with the group? How do we listen to the group? How do we, and that was a little disconcerting for us, but very, very interesting for him, because he never works like that. So that was a very steep learning curve for him. And I hope, you know, we will have a debrief afterwards. So that will be a piece in the Folkestone Triennale. In Norway, we have another experience. In Norway, we are working with village of 140 inhabitants. And so the group itself of commissioners, and it's a proper new patrons project. They came to us, they identified the issue, and it's a very ambitious project entailing the conversion of a building. What's interesting in those circumstances, and I think you probably have had those issues as well, is that you work with 5 people in a community of 140 people, then you're working at 2 levels, which you don't get in big cities, obviously, or even in the rural space, is that you have to negotiate with the stakeholders around the project, but you also have to present the project to the village. So we will have big village meetings where we're not asking the village to say yay or nay, but we're keeping them in the loop, because if we don't, they will obviously, make life difficult. And that was something that we had never had to do before. So it was the artist, we're working with Jeppe Hein and an architectural company a firm called Snuetta. And they came and presented the project to the village. And that was something that we felt could go very wrong. There was a few discussions. Not everybody in the village is happy, but at the end of the meeting, we were quite confident that we could go on to the next stage, and we had the okay, even if not everybody was totally excited about the form of the project. So that's lots of different. So each circumstance, each country, it's different, but it's also because of the way art in public realm functions in those specific countries. And in interesting enough, I find it most difficult in the United Kingdom, in Britain.
That makes total sense. I agree with you. There's a very problematic kind of neoliberally shaped history of participatory art. Amanda, before we open the floor to questions by everybody, let's quickly talk about your teaching program at the University of Lille, because you were the first to establish a continuous study program of mediation according to the New Patrons Protocol. And I think you even give a diploma for that. How do you teach mediation? I mean, what are kind of the messages, the aspects you try to bring over? And who are these people? Like, as you said, if you have someone who's 22 years old, I think it's not so easy to imagine that the role of the mediator can be played out in a kind of stable, confident way. So how old are those people, and what is their background? And what do they later, because not everybody can work as a New Patrons mediator money-wise or time-wise.
Okay, so we have, there are 2 levels there are 2 different programs that interlink. So I set up a master's program about exhibitions, curating exhibitions. And we've now developed a new strand to the master's program, which is specifically based on New Patrons. That is fairly recent. And so I think the problem is, as I said, and what you've just said, is these students have very little experience of the professional world. So it's very difficult to teach mediation if you don't have that experience of dealing with groups, of dealing with politicians. We haven't talked much about politics, but I mean, everything we do is politics, and so unfortunately, a lot of students, they don't have that sensibility to politics. They haven't understood how they are affected by politics. So what we do with the students at a master's level is we take them either as interns at Art Connection, if we can. We can't take them all. But that gives them an opportunity to follow very closely projects. And I think the most efficient way to teach is to do a project, basically. So we've done several projects where the students are mediators And sometimes they are commissioners and then they become mediators of their own project. And so we've done 3 projects like that, where the students identify the issue and then they write their brief. Then I will suggest an artist, and we're working with budgets that are not necessarily not very important, but we manage to find money. And then the students in a way become mediators of their own project. And I find that's the best way for them to confront all the issues. We're doing a project right now. We were invited by the International Student Union of the university. They asked the art department for students to make a fresque, to do a thing on the wall. And we said, our students don't do that. The fine art students don't do that. But I said, we have students who can enable you to find an artist and to broker that relationship with an artist. And so the International House became the commissioning group. They identified the kind of, we're still doing a fresque, we're still doing an art piece, a mural, because that was what was necessary. We didn't try and reinterpret what they wanted. We're delivering what they identified, but it is the students who actually helped them write the brief, and it is the students who actually chose the artists, and that work is going to be implemented. And so for those students, I think that's the best way. And we look obviously at all the issues linked to new patrons. And then the other program is a professional training program. So it is a diploma that is delivered by the university for people who are already professionals with more or less experience. So this year I have 11 students. We have the final session next week. It is 88 hours of training. So it's very, very compact. But here we're dealing with people that have experience of budgets. Most of them have had experience of politicians. Some people come from art institutions. Some people come from local authorities. So they're not necessarily on the same side of the politicians. They might be very close or very distant to the politics, but it means that you can have, it goes much quicker than with the students. With the students, I actually teach them how to make a budget. They've never done a budget. With these professional students, then we don't need to teach them how to do a budget, but we're talking about the kind of funding that we can look for and what you have to anticipate in the budget. So when we talk, we incorporate in this program a lot of issues that are fairly recent in France, and I don't know what the German equivalent is, but we talk a lot about cultural rights. You know, the idea of listening to people's culture, doing projects that are specific to the territory in which you're working with, being very au fait with the local cultural policies of where you're working. And so we have to be very specific about the necessity to analyze where you're going to be working. Obviously, it's much easier with professionals. What we find interesting is that they come with experience that is quite solid, but it's sometimes so solid that you have to give it a big nudge to get them to move. And in order for them to kind of adjust their practice. If they do the course, it's because they've identified a need, but getting them to adjust their practice is sometimes more difficult.
Yeah, it's actually an experience that we made. The people who need the longest time to understand new patrons are typically curators, professional curators. It sometimes seems like such a paradigm shift in their minds that it's not up to the expert to make decisions. They don't even get the methodology, even if you talk to them for 1 hour. It's really interesting.
I agree.
Yeah, there's an interesting question by Daniela, who started a first project in Colombia, Latin America. And she describes that in some countries where mediation or the protocol are not at all known or established, you basically have to kind of make your position, defend your position. And how do you deal with this? She writes, in terms of framing it correctly and in terms of requesting fund for an undefined outcome.
You mean how do you defend your role, as in to
yeah,
make your
like
role different?
In France, you can say we already made 400 projects in this country. Yeah, famous people were involved. Fondation de France was involved, and then politicians, for example, will have to listen to you. Kind of, you have some historic and symbolic legitimacy. But if you go to Colombia, or when I went to Nigeria or Cameroon, nobody has ever heard of the new patrons. And in order to mobilize funding or political support, how do you position yourself in that like situation where you have to convince everybody and where you have to keep the head up against a lot of doubt? Maybe do you have experience in that?
Maybe I would add a detail, is especially when you have to request funding for a yet undefined outcome. So how do you deal with that?
I think that undefined outcome is probably the most difficult, is that it's the process that you're asking for. We are being confronted with that now, actually, just now, because we are now finding money that we didn't have to find before. I think maybe what we are also exploring at the moment is this changing the language. I think sometimes it's necessary to change the language of what we do in order to basically tick the boxes. I had this experience with European funding. If you want money for artists, it doesn't work. But if you say you're working with researchers, it's a research project. And to be honest, everything we're doing is experimental and research every time, then it ticks the box. So if you change the language, what we're doing, we haven't talked about this, but it's something that we are talking a lot about in the training course. And I can send you the English translation of the contents of the course we teach. We talk about social innovation, what we're doing. And your role is you are the director of social innovation, working with a group of local people, and you are the enabler of social innovation. So if you change the language, because sometimes we don't have the good language in culture, but you find the language in economics or in social innovation or in cultural rights. Which might not be so big in Colombia, but it's something that, in Europe, we're talking more and more about. In France, they've just got onto that. And because everybody's onto it, then you just put it into that box. So I would suggest you just kind of change the way you label your box and make yourself a new title, a new badge, find a badge that fits into things that they will recognize.
We have the same learning process in Germany, and I will use some German words for the German speakers because I don't know the English translation. Querschnittsaufgabe, Daseinsfürsorge, ländliche Entwicklung. So there are a lot of buzzwords that resonate with politicians or foundations that and we often say, of course, at the end of the day, we're doing an art project, but let's not talk about art. What we actually do here is something else. Yeah, we deal with societal issues. We're managing social innovation experiments, etc. And that translation is something I think that we as mediators and project managers do all the time. And this is interesting about our practice. I find that it's hybrid. It really is a political practice. It is a social practice. It is a practice in language, in translating and narrating in ways that people can understand, that have never been in touch with art, or a mayor that doesn't like art, yeah, but he likes that his citizens get mobilized and take up their voice. So this is what makes our self-descriptions also so complex. Like when we write text for websites, etc. It's such a long story that needs to be told, and each time in different words.